Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Okay, we're back. We're back with more live from the Heartland for the week of June 3rd, and we are recording this on the 31st of May. And it really brings me a lot of pleasure to bring on our next guest, someone we had on live from the Heartland years ago when he had a new film and book out called Affluenza. The one and only John de Graaf, who I first learned about when he wrote a piece for the Coevolution Quarterly on the Wandervogel, hippies basically in Germany who went back to the land and then became supporters of Hitler and the Nazi regime. And I found it interesting at the time because there were a lot of people in the United States wanting to go back to the land, so to speak. And I was encouraging people to stay and be involved in the struggle. So John wrote that article. He came on the show one time, and now he has a new movie out. I'll let him tell you about it. But let me say, finally, hello to you, John de Graaf.
Hello to you, Mike James. It's been a while, but it's great to reconnect.
It's good. So you have a new film out about Stewart Udall, who really is an exemplary figure who expanded federal lands. He was a part of the government at different levels. He created national parks, seashores, lake shores, etc. So you have a new film out, Stewart Udall and the Politics of Beauty. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, Stu Udall was the Secretary of the Interior during that tumultuous time when you and I were at Berkeley and other places, and the Vietnam War was going on. So during both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, Stu Udall was the Secretary of the Interior, which meant that he was in charge of all of our public lands. And in so doing, I think he became the most famous Interior Secretary. He created more additions to our national park system, national monuments, wildlife refuges, all these kinds of things than any Interior Secretary in history. But he was not just that. He was also a strong fighter for civil rights. He integrated the national park system, which in 1961 was actually still segregated. There were no black rangers in our national parks. He forced the then Washington Redskins, now the Commanders, to integrate. They were the only NFL team that wouldn't hire black players at that time, and they played in the National Stadium, which the Department of the Interior controlled. And so Stewart said, if you want to play here, if you want us to lease this stadium, you have to stop discriminating. You have to hire black athletes. They did that, and they hired 2 that year, and they became a much better team. And the Washington Post even suggested that Stewart Udall should be named NFL Coach of the Year because no one had done more to improve the status of a team. But Stewart was very committed to civil rights. He integrated the University of Arizona when he was a basketball star there in the 1940s. It was a segregated university. Blacks could not eat in the cafeteria. Stewart forced a change in that, he and his brother Mo, by bringing their black friends with them to the cafeteria and saying, kick us out. And the administration backed down because they were the most popular guys on campus, so to speak. But Stewart was also involved in so many other issues. Later on, after he was out of Interior, he spent 10 years of his life fighting for folks who were the victims of nuclear fallout from atmospheric nuclear tests in the Nevada desert during the Cold War, and for Navajo uranium miners who were also victims of the atomic era. And he finally succeeded in getting compensation for those people through Congress, although he lost in the courts time after time. He was the first public official to talk at all about global warming and the threat that was, and he did that in the mid-1960s. So he was a guy very much ahead of his time in many ways.
Let's look a little bit at his foresight. I mean, you mentioned global warming. He was really ahead of his time on a lot of stuff, and he was reading Rachel Carlson, who wrote some great stuff about the environment, right? And her
birthday was just the other day. Rachel Carson wrote the famous book Silent Spring. And of course, the pesticide industry, who she criticized because it was killing the birds with all these poisons, hated her, and they tried to stop her. But Stewart believed in what she was doing, and he introduced her to John Kennedy. He became a friend of hers and a mentor, and really helped her message get out because he believed in it. And that was a kind of a courageous thing for a politician to do at that time, given the power of these chemical industries.
Let's talk a little bit about his upbringing. He grew up, he's a Mormon. He was a Mormon.
Yes.
He balked at that later on, but, we don't hear about too many liberal or progressive Mormons. I mean, there are some, I've known a number over my lifetime, but he's living out in Arizona. His family is Republican. He ends up going to Congress. He runs as a Democrat. Talk a little bit about him being a Mormon and what the opportunities that created for him, as well as probably some barriers to doing the things he wanted to do.
Well, during the 1930s, many Mormons actually in the rural West became Democrats because they saw what the New Deal did for people. They then seemed sadly Republicans again during the Cold War and the McCarthy era. But during the 30s, the state of Utah, for example, was solidly Democratic.
Right.
And the state of Arizona was Democratic. And Stewart's father, who was a Republican, switched to the Democratic Party. He was an attorney and a rancher in Arizona, who later became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and did many progressive rulings. But anyway, Stewart's dad said to his kids, look, he said, we're out in this godforsaken place here in the middle of the desert because no one wanted us to be where we were before, which was in Illinois and Missouri and places, and they pushed us out. And so Brigham Young went west because we had to kind of find a place where we could live and not be discriminated against. And he said, and now there are many other people in our society who are discriminated against. And so we have an obligation to support them as we would have wanted to be supported in our case. And that idea about social justice really became a part of Stewart's life and his upbringing. At the age of, in 1947, when he returned to the University of Arizona from World War II, or 1946, he and his brother immediately joined the NAACP in Tucson to push for civil rights. So, yeah, he was somewhat unusual, certainly would be unusual for a Mormon today, but less unusual at the time.
Good point. He also liked poetry a lot, and he talked about the environment, in terms of its beauty and its glory.
Absolutely. And Robert Frost, when Stewart went to Congress in 1955, Robert Frost was the official poet of Congress. But the fact is, nobody in Congress paid any attention to him. I wasn't too happy about that. But Stewart loved poetry. His mother had read it to him as a kid. Those Mormon families in the West loved poetry and drama and those kind of things, and dance and music and all of that. So we went to Robert Frost and he said, I'd like to get to know you. I'd like to support you. And they became close friends. And Stewart proposed that John Kennedy have Robert Frost read a poem at his inaugural, which happened. And then Stewart actually went with Robert Frost in 1962 to the Soviet Union. He was the first U.S. cabinet member to visit the Soviet Union ever, period. And he went supposedly to look at their energy grid and talk about energy issues with the Russians and with Russian scientists. But really his goal, and Frost's, was to meet with Premier Nikita Khrushchev, which Udall did, and talk about ending the nuclear arms race. And how far they got, it's hard to say, but the next year, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis intervened and came shortly after, but at least it didn't end in a disaster that people thought it might. And a year later, Khrushchev and Kennedy signed the atmospheric nuclear test
ban. John, one of the things that caught my attention, it's in the film, is how Stewart Udall reversed his position on a couple of things, not only the creation of dams in certain dams, but also the Vietnam War. And he had to take a position, he had to decide, am I going to speak out about certain things and then no longer be the Secretary of the Interior? Or do I stay in and get some stuff done? Talk a little bit about that and the choices he had to make and how he handled them.
Absolutely. So the first choice was over whether we should have dams in the Grand Canyon, which was at that time proposed. No one would even think that imaginable now, but at them they actually had plans. They'd actually started construction of two power dams in the Grand Canyon that would have flooded part of the national park. And Stewart had been a supporter of dams. He was a rural Westerner. He was from Arizona, where you could not be against water development and dams because that was what the whole thing was all about. You got Arizonans want water, and so Stewart knew that if he spoke out against these, if he stopped these dams, which he could do as Secretary of the Interior, he would never be able to run for office in Arizona again. And everybody thought he might be the next senator, governor, and so forth. So he had faced this very tough choice. And he said, well, I got to let the river tell me what to do. So he took his kids on a raft trip down the Grand Canyon, and he was so struck by the beauty of it and the place that he said, there will be no dams here. And that doomed him from any further role in politics in Arizona. The second decision he made, which was very difficult for him, was his position on the Vietnam War. Stewart initially supported the war. He was one of those people who was worried about the domino theory and all that. It was a genuine feeling, but he very quickly, once the war started, came to realize that the war was a disaster, that it was a terrible mistake, that it was killing Americans, killing Vietnamese, destroying the environment. And so he turned against the war, and he started speaking to Johnson and the cabinet, and especially Robert McNamara, against the war. And his brother Mo, who agreed with him, who's in Congress, gave a public speech against the war. And Stewart had to decide, do I do that too? Do I step out and make a public speech against the war in which Johnson will fire me for sure? Because Johnson had said, if you go and do what your brother did, you're done. Better look for a new job. So had to make a hard decision. And he decided that he should keep his fight inside. He should keep pushing Johnson. He should keep pushing McNamara and these people, but he should not go public and give up his job because Johnson was so supportive of his environmental measures, and he wanted to keep those things going. And
Yeah,
indeed, that's what he did. And that's what he did.
In the film how Johnson really, in a way, needed him to take people's minds off the war. But Stewart's one of his kids defected from the army and went to Canada, right?
Right. His son Scott, his second son, who's the only one of his kids I've never met because he's no longer living. But Scott defected from the army, and he deserted, and he went to New Mexico, and his friend Jack Leffler, who's in the film, was able to help him get to Canada, where Scott then lived for quite a few years. This was hard for Udall because, he's in this big position in government and his son is a deserter.
Yes.
But Udall supported his son, and he said that my son has his own conscience. I support his conscience. And, and of course, he personally opposed the war, too. Scott came back under the Carter amnesty to the U.S. and ended up being a social worker in Flagstaff, Arizona. But yeah, these were the kind of choices that Udall had to face. And he felt that first and foremost, he had to do his job as an Interior Secretary. And he did push hard. And it's interesting that Craig McNamara, who's the son of Robert McNamara, and who was a very strong anti-war kid himself at the time, saw the film and wrote to me and said that even his dad and Stewart were good friends. They went backpacking together. They liked each other on a personal basis. And he said he had no idea, because his dad never told him, that Stewart was against the war. His dad wouldn't talk about that. He said, so when he saw my film, it made him admire Stewart even more. And he said, I only wish that my dad had listened to Stewart Udall.
John de Graaf, in the film, you talk about, or you don't talk about, but you show really a strong relationship between Stewart Udall and Lady Bird Johnston, the wife of the president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, as well as David Brower of the Sierra Club. And that caught my attention because I remember meeting David Brower in the Heartland Cafe's general store when he had been there eating. And I didn't know who he was, but I got filled in pretty quickly. Talk a little bit about the relationship he had with both those people and what it meant.
Sure. When he got, of course, he had met Lady Bird when he was there under Kennedy. But there were people who told him, if you want to get to LBJ, go through Lady Bird, because he listens to what she has to say. And so he got Lady Bird to go with him on a trip around the West in 1964, and on a trip down the Snake River in the Grand Teton National Park, he kind of jawboned her about you should make a name for yourself as a conservationist. I know you love nature, I know all these things. You should start with a beautification campaign, and you should really become a symbol of conservation. And Lady Bird later in her memoirs said, well, Stu was an excellent salesman, and he convinced me that this was for me. And she started with a beautification campaign in Washington, D.C. and in places. A lot of people kind of chuckled at that and felt, oh, isn't that sweet? But Lady Bird was actually a much stronger environmentalist than that. And she pushed for many things that ruffled big corporate feathers and other things. So she and Stewart were very good friends, and she shared Stewart's values and ideas, and vice versa. David Brower was Stewart's he was probably the most important environmental figure outside of government at that point. And mostly they were on the same side of things. They worked together to create Point Reyes National Seashore in California, for example. But they clashed on the Grand Canyon dams because David knew right from the start that this was a terrible idea. And Stewart initially was supporting it because, as an Arizona politician, he had to. And so David bombarded Stewart with letters and various kinds of things. And of course, Stewart changed his mind and he stopped the dams. And from that point on, David and Stewart were extremely close. Instead of being on the same side 90% of the time, they were probably on the same side almost 100% of the time. And their cooperation was very important, and they both respected each other very much. I met Stewart Udall when I was making a film about David Brower for PBS in 1989 and in 88, and that's when I first interviewed Stewart and met him and was very impressed by him because he was so humble. And he basically said, look, I was wrong. David Brower persuaded me I was wrong, he said. And for that, I'm in his debt. No question about it. How often do you hear that kind of thing from a politician?
Not very often.
Yeah, I'm in my critic's debt because he changed my mind and showed me I was wrong. That's what made me admire Stewart in the first place.
Is that the reason what led you to make this movie?
Yeah, well, it was partly that I met Stewart, but I wasn't thinking about making a film until I saw a piece in the paper. I don't even know if it was the Times, the Post, what it was, but it was those things where it says 100 years ago today. You've seen those in the newspapers, and said 100 years ago today, Stewart Udall, Secretary of the Interior, was born. And I thought, Stewart Udall, wow, I wonder what ever happened to him. I kind of lost touch. And
you probably had some footage of him, right?
Well, just that interview that I did. Yeah, I have that. So I looked up, started doing some research, and then this guy's pretty amazing. I knew about his environmental stuff in the parks, and I knew about the Grand Canyon dams. I didn't know anything about his commitment to civil rights or peace or the other thing, the arts, which he was also I didn't know anything about that. So I became more interested, and I checked, and nobody had done a film about him. And so I got to do this. This is my calling, is to make a film about this guy because he deserves it. And this is a quintessential American story about the 60s. And it's a good way to teach young people about all kinds of things in addition to inspire them through Stewart's work.
Well, let's talk a little bit about his family. I mean, in the film, he had a lot of kids, and they got grandkids, and he's got brother who was a politician. It's a unique family, and they all seem to be doing really good. I had a hard time keeping track of who was a senator from where. Was his brother from Arizona, I guess. And I don't know, was there any Udalls in Utah that were elected? I couldn't keep track anymore. But talk a little bit about his family and all those people.
Not in Utah. His oldest son, Tom, became a U.S. Senator, served 2 terms as U.S. Senator from New Mexico. Tom was a fantastic guy, and he was, my best source for information about his dad. And he said, that family just imbued them all that what you got to do is public service. That's what it's all about. You have to help others and serve. So Tom was a great U.S. Senator, and he is now the U.S. Ambassador to New Zealand. So And while he was there, with the film, he used one time showed the film because he seemed to love the film, and he showed it to Caroline Kennedy, who is the ambassador to Australia. They watched it together and talked about their dads, and Tom said they said that was quite a great experience. But yeah, Udall had 6 kids. Scott is the only one who passed away, and I interviewed Dennis, who it works for George Lucas in California, Jay, who's a poet in Virginia, and Lynn, who's a former teacher in Santa Fe, New Mexico. But they're all great people. And then I interviewed Lynn's son, Bryce, Stewart's grandson, who took care of Stewart when he was a high school student, when Stewart was by himself in old age and he was losing his eyesight and everything. Bryce is a wonderful guy. He's an actor in New York City now. But it's quite a family. And so is Mo's family. I know Ann Udall, one of Mo's daughters, is the head of Planned Parenthood of Oregon. She and I are going to be on a panel together in Bend, Oregon in 2 weeks. His daughter, Mo's daughter, Kate, is the narrator of the film.
What's the relationship of the young fellow who is the mayor of some small town? Is it St. John's?
St. John's, yeah, that's where Stewart grew up. And it's a one-horse podunk place in the middle of nowhere, you know.
But there's a Udall who's a mayor there now, right?
Spence, yeah, Spence is the mayor. There's still a lot of Udalls in St. John's. It's become much more of a Republican town nowadays. It's very Mormon, and Spence is Mormon, but Spence is a Democrat, and Spence definitely, shares most of Stewart's views on things.
What's their relationship?
They're kind of distant cousins. It's about, because of the Mormons, they had the same paternal. I mean, Stewart's grandfather was Spence's great grandfather, but Spence is descended from a different wife, because in those days the Mormons practiced polygamy.
All right, so let's round this up by talking about how, in a lot of ways, this is a monumental person, environmentalist, all kind of visions, and we don't hear much about him. So what is his legacy? What's important for people to know about him and for us to try to share to the masses so that they can get a sense of what came before and how we missed the boat perhaps on doing more about it when we had a chance, and now we're being really pushed to deal with the environment.
Well, I think the sad thing, and you and I both know this, Mike, is that Lyndon Johnson, who did many good things, completely destroyed his legacy with his hubris about the Vietnam War and his inability to get out of that war. If it hadn't been for that war, I think Johnson would go down as one of our greatest presidents. And I think Stewart and all of them would be more well known, but it was hard to focus on all those good things he was doing and Johnson was doing when we had the war in our faces. I think that was a big deal. But I think Stewart really does offer, I think his idea of a politics of beauty, that the whole concept of protecting nature and creating parks for people and protecting clean air and clean water and all those things which he did and which are being threatened now by the Supreme Court and others. Those things that Stewart did brought people together. That was his view, that these were issues that could be bipartisan. They're less so now, but in those days they were. A lot of Republicans supported Stewart Udall, and Southern Democrats who were racist and hated Stewart's views on race opposed him. So it was a different time when the parties were different. There was more bipartisanship. In some cases, there was extreme bipartisanship because the Wild and Scenic Rivers Bill, which now protects 250 rivers in the United States from any kind of development, that passed unanimously in the United States Senate. That was a Stewart Udall bill. It passed 265-7 in the U.S. House. That's how much support there was. And to add to that, the bill that during the Trump administration, the most bipartisan bill that passed, and very few bills did, but the most bipartisan was the Great American Outdoors Act, which is about funding our parks, funding the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which gives all kinds of support to cities for their environment and everything. And that bill was sponsored in Congress. The top sponsor in the Senate was Tom Udall, Stewart's son. the top sponsor in the House was Deb Haaland, who is the Native American woman who's now our Secretary of the Interior and is also in the film. But that passed heavily, 2/3 to 3/4 in both houses. Trump signed it, but it would have gone over his veto if he hadn't signed it. I think it shows that this is an issue, the protection of nature and parks, that can help bring people together in this very polarized time, and it's something Stewart believed in.
How do people get to see the film, order the film, and any parting shots that you'd like to
Yeah,
share?
sure. Well, no, I don't know about parting shots, but
That's a
the
bad
film is
word these days. I'm as a photographer guy some of the time. I got looking for other words for taking pictures.
That's good. You know, my son, all the Pacific Northwest video in the film is shot by my son, who's quite a nature photographer, and he
Yeah, it's
loves
some
it
beautiful stuff
and
in
everything. Which is, that's, you know, about the only thing he probably got from me was the love of nature. But anyway, it's a great thing. And the film is available from Bullfrog Films. It's bullfrogfilms.com. They're in Pennsylvania, and they're the largest distributor of environmental media in the world. And I think they love this film, and so they're trying to make it available as inexpensively as possible for community groups, for schools, for universities, and for individuals. So bullfrogfilms.com, Stewart Udall film, you'll find it there. And you know, I've been doing a lot of screenings in colleges and universities. I want to do more, so I'm always open to anybody who wants me to come and show the film. We've done about 40 so far. Even doing some in Europe in the summer. There's an interest in the film in Europe too, which I'm excited about.
Well, John de Graaf, it's always a pleasure talking to you, seeing you. I'm glad we hooked up again. And you know, when I get to the West Coast, I think you're up in the Northwest, Seattle or someplace.
That's right.
I went up and saw my friend Magazine not too long ago, and if I had known, I'd probably try to get to see you too. But next time.
The pleasure was all mine, and keep up the good work.
I will, and we'll be in touch.
Solidarity forever.